Hi everyone, hi YouTube. Time for some more economics discussion. If you've been following this channel, you know that basically what I talk about is wealth inequality, the ways in which wealth inequality is hurting the economy, hurting the middle class, hurting the working class, and the things that we can do to address that growing wealth inequality so that it at least stops, if not starts to reverse, and ordinary people can live prosperous lives again. Last week, I talked about the importance of politics in our goal and the importance of building a bipartisan movement in support of wealth tax to address wealth inequality. So I'm going to be talking about politics again this week, although this time I think it might surprise you what the topic is. This week, I want to look at another political movement that has very broad public support, which is the release of the Epstein files, the files that are associated with the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein and his sex trafficking operation. And you might be wondering, why do you want to talk about this? It doesn't really have anything to do with economics, and you would be right. But it is a popular movement that's happening right now, and I think that if we look at some of the strengths of this movement, we can apply them to the movement for addressing wealth inequality and reforming the tax code. So the first thing that I think is important to recognize about this movement is it's got a very discrete and achievable goal. The goal of the movement is to release the files associated with the Epstein investigation to the public. That's it. It's not a movement to stop all sex trafficking across the world. That would be a very noble goal, but it's a lot less achievable, it's a lot less discrete. It's hard to know when you've actually done it. It's hard to organize, what methods would be effective. Instead, this is just a very single, discrete thing that the public wants, that they're demanding from the government. The second thing that I want to recognize is that the movement has very good messaging around the motivations for why they want the files released. They want the files released because they want to see powerful people who they believe are implicated in the files face some sort of justice, and they want justice for the victims who were sex trafficked. This messaging around the motivation is really important because this movement is so broad that it really cannot be organized by a single organization or group of people. It must appeal to the sensibilities of the public at large. The last thing that I want to consider about this movement is its endurance. This call to release the Epstein files has been going on for months and months and months and months. And a lot of stuff has happened to be able to distract the public in that time. But I think because the messaging and the goal are so discrete and so clear, that all you have to do is say, release the Epstein files, and you remind people that the movement is still happening. It's not over yet. The fight is still being fought. We got to keep going. What's likely to happen next for this movement is that once government resumes and Congress is back in session, they're going to force a vote on releasing these files. At that point, the movement will have essentially a list of the politicians that they need to pressure in order to get what they want. And that's a very powerful thing when you have a list of opponents who either need to be talked into giving you what you want or replaced with other politicians who will. So let's swing this back to economics. What can we learn from this movement? How can we apply what I just talked about to fighting wealth inequality? Well, the first thing is a clear, discrete, and achievable goal. Reforming the tax code is the broad goal, but I think we do need to come to an agreement to a specific tax policy that we feel effectively targets the growing wealth inequality and will at least stop it, if not start to reverse it. Now, there have been specific policies advanced by politicians. In 2020, during her presidential run, Senator Elizabeth Warren proposed an ultra-millionaire tax, which was a 2% tax on fortunes over $50 million, and then an additional 1%, raising to a total of 3% on fortunes over $1 billion. That might not be the absolute most effective wealth tax, but it is one that is pretty easy for average folk to understand and would certainly address wealth inequality, at least in some way. So that was point number 1, which is messaging around the goal. Now let's talk about point number 2, which is messaging around motivation. There are a lot of different motivations for taxing the rich, and not all of them have broad appeal. I think, for example, the least popular reason to tax the rich is to pay for means-tested assistance programs, which is basically a program that's only available to folks below a certain income threshold. These are unpopular both because people who are above the income threshold do not want to pay for a program with their taxed money that they cannot benefit from, and they are also unpopular with people below that income threshold because they feel like they're being patronized, they're being given a handout, and what they really want is the opportunity to work for a life in which they can be prosperous and not rely on the government for assistance. I really think that the most effective messaging here is the messaging by Gary Stevenson, which is essentially that if we don't do something to address growing wealth inequality, it is going to cause the economy to collapse, cause living standards to collapse, and people won't be able to live an ordinary life working an ordinary job. That is something that I feel like a lot of people are feeling already. And if you're not feeling it yet, you probably will soon, or your kids will, or your grandkids will, because there simply is not enough to go around with so much of the wealth being siphoned off to the top 1%. Okay, so now let's talk about endurance and focus, which is basically how do we help this movement endure in a world where every week, sometimes every day, there is another thing happening that seems to demand our attention and demand our focus away from the goal of addressing wealth inequality. So just in my opinion, the slogans that we've been using up to this point are not as effective as they need to be for bringing together a broad coalition of people. If you say tax the rich, you ask the question, well, who is rich? And depending on where you draw that line, you're going to get different levels of support. When you say make the rich pay their fair share, now you're bringing into question concepts of fairness, which are going to be different depending on who you're talking to. Now, the slogan tax wealth not work from Gary Stevenson also has some problems because if we're being honest, we do need to tax work without completely overhauling our tax system. And maybe that overhaul would be a good idea, but it's outside of the scope of our goal, which is just stopping wealth inequality from getting any worse. My suggestion is that we start using the slogan, wealth tax now. And the reason that I think that slogan will be effective is because it is pointed and direct toward our goal, similar to how Release the Epstein Files is pointed and direct to the goal of that movement. When it comes to motivation, I think the broadest appeal motivation is to reduce wealth inequality, to prevent the economy from collapsing, and to allow working people and the children and grandchildren of working people to be able to own property like their own homes. I think if we center around that goal, that messaging, and that motivation, we'll be able to build a movement that can draw a clear line in the sand, which will allow us to identify that the politicians that are willing to work with us and the politicians that we still need to convince or replace. That's all for this week. Again, thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Do all the things that let YouTube know that this video is worth watching, and I will see you again next week.